The call came through at 11:47 p.m. Single vehicle rollover on Interstate 40. Westbound lane, mile marker 73. Officer Brian Matthews had been a K-9 handler for 7 years, and his German Shepherd partner Rex had been with him for 5. They'd worked everything from drug busts to missing person cases, but vehicle accidents always carried their own particular weight. The uncertainty, the race against time, the hope that whoever was involved had survived. When they arrived at the scene, the highway was already chaos. Red and blue lights strobed across twisted metal and shattered glass. The vehicle, a dark sedan, lay upside down in the median, its roof completely crushed, windows blown out. Debris stretched across 3 lanes. First responders were already on scene, and the fire department was setting up equipment to stabilize the wreckage. Captain Rodriguez approached Brian as he stepped out of his patrol vehicle. "No driver in the car," Rodriguez said, his voice tight. "Either ejected or fled on foot. We've got a blood trail heading east along the tree line. Looks like someone took off injured." Brian nodded, reaching back to open the rear door. Rex bounded out, his entire body alert and focused. The German Shepherd had been trained for tracking, for detection, for search and rescue. He knew when he was called to a scene like this, someone's life was on the line. "Let's get him on the scent," Brian said, walking Rex toward the overturned vehicle. The dog immediately began working, his nose low to the ground, moving in calculated patterns around the wreckage. Other officers were spreading out, flashlights cutting through the darkness along the eastbound tree line where the blood trail led, but Rex didn't follow them. Instead, he circled back to the median, then stopped. His ears went rigid. He turned his head sharply to the west, away from the crash, away from the blood trail, away from where everyone else was searching. "Rex track," Brian commanded, pointing toward the east where the other officers had gone. The dog didn't move. He remained locked in place, staring westward across the highway toward the opposite side. His nose was working the air, not the ground. Brian felt the first flicker of unease. In 5 years, Rex had never ignored a direct command. Not once. "What is it, boy?" Brian asked, his voice lower now, uncertain. Rex turned to look at him, and in that moment, Brian saw something in the dog's eyes he'd rarely witnessed. Absolute certainty. Rex wasn't confused. He wasn't distracted. He had found something, and it wasn't where anyone expected. Against protocol, against logic, Brian made a decision. "All right," he said quietly, unclipping Rex's lead. "Show me." The German Shepherd took off like a shot. Not east, west. He sprinted across the median, leaped over the guardrail on the far side, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the highway. Brian's heart hammered as he called out to the other officers, then took off after his partner. His radio crackling with confused voices asking what the hell he was doing. Rex was fast. But Brian managed to keep his flashlight beam on the dog's dark form as it moved through brush and over uneven terrain. They were heading away from the accident site, away from the logical search perimeter. A quarter mile. Half a mile. Rex never slowed, never hesitated. His nose was locked onto something invisible, something only he could detect. They crossed an access road. Climbed through a barbed wire fence. Rex's pace never faltered. Brian was breathing hard now, his lungs burning. Behind him, he could hear other officers trying to catch up, their voices distant and bewildered. 1 mile. Then nearly 2. Brian's legs were screaming, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the cold night air. And then finally Rex stopped. They had reached a drainage canal, one of the many that ran parallel to the highway system, carrying rainwater away from the roads. The canal was concrete, about 15 feet wide with steep sloped sides. At the bottom, maybe 8 feet down, was a trickle of water and dense brush growing along the edges. Rex was at the edge of the canal barking. Not his alert bark. His emergency bark. The one that meant life or death. Brian scrambled down the slope, his flashlight sweeping across the bottom of the canal. At first he saw nothing. Just concrete, water, and vegetation. But Rex was already down there, pushing through thick brush near the water line, and then Brian saw it. A small hand, pale, unmoving. "Oh God," Brian breathed. He keyed his radio with shaking hands. "I need paramedics at my location now. I've got a victim, juvenile, unresponsive." He crashed through the brush to where Rex stood guard over a small figure. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, lay crumpled against the concrete slope. Her clothes were soaked, torn, and stained dark with blood. Her skin was gray, lips blue. She wasn't moving. Brian dropped to his knees beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. For a terrible moment, he felt nothing. Then, faint as a whisper, he detected it. A pulse. Weak. Irregular. But there. "She's alive," he called out, hearing the voices of other officers arriving at the canal's edge. "Barely. She's hypothermic. Get those paramedics here." As he carefully assessed the girl for injuries, trying not to move her in case of spinal damage, his mind raced. Who was she? How did she get here? And why had Rex tracked to her instead of following the blood trail from the accident? The answer came in pieces. The girl had blood on her clothes, but as the paramedics arrived and began working on her with heated blankets and gentle examination, it became clear that much of the blood wasn't hers. She had injuries, abrasions, a possible concussion, early-stage hypothermia. But the amount of blood on her clothing suggested someone else's trauma. Brian, one of the other officers, called from up near the access road. "You need to see this." Brian climbed back up the canal slope, leaving Rex to watch over the girl as the paramedics worked. The officer led him about 30 yards back toward the highway. There, in the dirt and gravel, illuminated by flashlight beams, was a clear trail. Drag marks, small, leading from the direction of the highway toward the canal. Someone had dragged this child out here after the accident and left her to die. The realization hit Brian like a physical blow. The blood trail heading east from the crash. A diversion. The driver hadn't fled injured in that direction. They'd gone west, carrying or dragging this little girl, and dumped her in the canal before disappearing into the night. Back at the canal, the paramedics were loading the girl onto a spine board. "She's stable enough to transport," one of them said. "But we need to move fast. Her core temp is dangerously low." As they lifted her, something fell from her clothing. A small plastic card. Brian picked it up, shining his light on it. A school ID. The photo showed the same little girl, smiling, healthy. The name read, Chloe Martinez, 7 years old, Riverside Elementary. "Run that name," Brian said to another officer, his voice hard. "I want to know if she's been reported missing." The response came back within minutes. Chloe Martinez had been reported missing 6 hours earlier by her mother. Last seen leaving school. Never made it home. An Amber Alert had been issued. Every officer in 3 counties had been looking for her, and somehow, impossibly, Rex had found her. 2 miles from a car accident that seemed completely unrelated. Unless it wasn't unrelated at all. At the hospital. While doctors worked to stabilize Chloe, Brian stood in the corridor with Captain Rodriguez and Detective Sarah Chun from the Missing Persons Unit. The pieces were coming together now, and the picture they formed was dark. "The vehicle was reported stolen 3 days ago," Detective Chen said, scrolling through her tablet. "Owner is a woman from 2 counties over. No connection to the Martinez family that we can find yet. The blood trail heading east was intentional," Brian said. "Whoever was driving knew we'd follow it. They wanted us going the wrong direction while they disposed of the girl." Rodriguez's face was grim. "So we're looking at abduction, assault, possibly attempted murder. The crash might have been accidental, or the perpetrator might have lost control trying to evade something." "There were skid marks," Chun added, "before the rollover point, like someone hit the brakes hard." "We're checking traffic cameras from earlier in the evening to see if we can track the vehicle's movements." A doctor emerged from Chloe's room, and they all turned. "She's going to make it," the doctor said, and Brian felt something loosen in his chest. Hypothermia, contusions, minor lacerations, but nothing life-threatening. "She was lucky. Can we talk to her?" Chun asked. "Not yet. She's sedated. Maybe in the morning. But there's something you should know." The doctor's expression darkened. "The blood on her clothing? We ran a quick type. It's not hers. And there's a lot of it." Back at the accident scene, crime scene investigators were going over every inch of the vehicle. What they found confirmed Brian's worst fears. Blood in the driver's seat. Blood in the trunk. And when they ran the VENG number and cross-referenced it with recent activity, they found something else. The stolen vehicle had been spotted on traffic cameras over the past 3 days in 4 different locations. Each location corresponded to a school. Each sighting occurred during dismissal hours. "He was hunting," Brian said quietly, standing at the edge of the highway as dawn began to break. Rex sat beside him, calm now, watching the investigators work. This wasn't opportunistic. He was targeting children. Detective Chen stood nearby, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with other agencies. When she hung up, her face was pale. "We've got a possible ID on the driver." Facial recognition from a gas station camera 3 hours before the crash. Marcus Webb, 34, registered sex offender. Multiple priors involving minors. He's been off-grid for 6 months, violated parole. "Do we know where he is now?" Rodriguez asked. "Not yet. But he's injured. That blood in the driver's seat is his. He can't have gotten far on foot." But Marcus Webb had gotten farther than anyone expected. For 3 days, a manhunt stretched across 2 states. Police followed leads, checked hospitals, monitored known associates. Webb seemed to have vanished, until Rex found him again. It happened almost by accident. Brian and Rex were conducting a routine search of an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of town, following up on a tip that had ultimately led nowhere. As they were heading back to their vehicle, Rex suddenly stopped. His entire body went rigid. The same stance he'd taken at the accident scene. "What is it, boy?" Brian asked, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Rex's nose was working the air, his focus locked on a cluster of old warehouses about 100 yards away. Brian called it in, then approached carefully. The warehouse Rex was focused on had broken windows and a rusted door hanging off its hinges. Inside it was dark, filled with debris and the smell of decay. Rex didn't wait for permission. He moved into the building, navigating through the shadows with absolute confidence. Brian followed, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. They found him in a back corner, behind a pile of rotting pallets. Marcus Webb was barely conscious, slumped against the wall. His left arm was wrapped in filthy cloth, soaked through with blood. The crash injuries had become infected. He looked up as Brian's light found him, his eyes glazed with fever. "Don't move," Brian commanded. His weapon trained on Webb. Backup was already on the way. Their sirens growing louder in the distance. Webb didn't try to run. He didn't have the strength. He just stared at Rex with something like disbelief. "The dog," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "That's the dog from the highway," Brian said coldly. "That's the dog from the highway. The one who saved the little girl you tried to kill." The trial came 4 months later. Chloe Martinez, recovered and brave, testified about her abduction. How Webb had approached her after school, claiming to be a friend of her mother's. How he'd driven her to a remote area. How she'd fought him, scratched him, bitten him, trying to escape. How he'd panicked when he heard police sirens in the distance. Sirens that weren't even for him but had spooked him into fleeing. How he'd lost control of the vehicle on the highway. The crash violent enough to daze him but not stop him. And how, in his desperation to escape, he'd dragged her from the wreckage and thrown her into the canal, leaving her to die of exposure while he created a false trail. But Chloe didn't remember the rescue. She'd been unconscious by then, her body shutting down from hypothermia. She didn't remember the German shepherd who had defied logic and training to find her in the darkness. Brian told her about it, though. Visited her and her family after the trial, brought Rex with him. The dog who had saved her life. Chloe knelt down and wrapped her arms around Rex's neck. The German shepherd stood perfectly still, accepting her embrace with quiet dignity. "How did he know where to find me?" Chloe asked, looking up at Brian with wide eyes. Everyone was looking in the wrong place. Brian crouched down beside them. "I've thought about that a lot," he said. Rex was trained to track, to follow scents and trails. But that night, he didn't follow a trail on the ground. He tracked something in the air. Something the rest of us couldn't detect. "What?" Chloe asked. "I think he smelled your blood," Brian said gently. "Even from 2 miles away. Even with the wind and the chaos and everything else. He caught your scent and he knew you were out there. He knew you needed help." Chloe's mother, standing nearby, wiped tears from her eyes. "We can never thank you enough," she said. Both of you. Brian smiled, scratching behind Rex's ears. Thank him. I just followed where he led. In the years that followed, Rex's story spread. News outlets picked it up. Training facilities studied the case, trying to understand how a dog could detect a scent from such a distance, across such challenging terrain. Some said it was impossible. Others said it was instinct. A few called it a miracle. Brian knew it was something simpler and more profound. It was the bond between handler and dog. The trust. The willingness to follow even when logic said to go the other direction. On Rex's final day of service, 5 years after the Chloe Martinez rescue, Brian stood with him one last time at the training facility. The German Shepherd was older now, graying around the muzzle, his movements a bit slower. But his eyes were still sharp. Still intelligent. You saved a lot of lives, buddy, Brian said softly. But that night on the highway? That was your finest moment. When you knew better than all of us. Rex looked up at him, and for just a moment, Brian could have sworn the dog understood every word. They walked out of the facility together, into retirement, into a quieter life. But the legacy remained. The little girl who lived because a dog refused to follow the obvious path. The handler who learned to trust instinct over evidence, and somewhere, in a small house with a backyard, Chloe Martinez grew up healthy and strong. Never forgetting the German Shepherd who found her when everyone else was looking the wrong way.